Hey up and welcome to the Strategy Sessions Live. Thank you for joining us. This is the first Strategy Sessions Live and it is called the Black Edition. What is the Black Edition? Well, I'm sure you'll be aware that on the 25th of May, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. It was an incident that had a huge effect, not just in America, but it had ripples across the world. Social media, a tool that many marketers use to amplify their campaigns, was instrumental in amplifying what happened to George Floyd and setting off a chain of demonstrations, which then led to the police officer being arrested on the 29th of May, and those protests then spread around the world. As an individual, I saw the information coming up on Twitter, mainly about George Floyd's murder, and I'd never wanted to see the video. I saw it on the evening news and it had a really deep effect on me, something that I've never felt before for somebody who I don't know. As the protests spread around the world to the UK, Paris, New Zealand, Brazil, thousands of people took to the streets, and the movement really, under the Black Lives Matter banner, the movement really took off. In the UK, in Bristol, we've seen statues of slavers toppled and thrown into the river. And there's been an energy about the protests and the demonstrations that really is different to anything I think I've seen and witnessed before. Last week, we had Rand Fishkin and Greg Gifford on the Strategy Sessions podcast. It was supposed to be a celebration of everything that's good and great in the USA and talk about marketing and just talk to some really great marketers about that. I took my section and talked about what happened to George Floyd and how that made me feel and some things I thought could happen to that. I was worried about it, and it was overwhelmingly positively received. Messages I've had from people, some of whom I've not spoken to in years, were really uplifting. And it, as I say, it feels like there's a different conversation being had about race and racism at the moment. So I wanted to keep that conversation going. I'm in marketing. I have been my whole adult career, and it's what I know. Marketing has a really pivotal role, I think, in this, because we're at the interface between what companies say and what customers see. Marketing is at that interface. So what I wanted to do was to hold this live session today where we bring some amazing marketers from across the US and the UK onto it to discuss what we can do as a community, as people, and as marketers. I would ask you to bear with us. It's the first live I've ever done. It's the first live I think many of us have done in this way. So if there are any technical problems, please do stick with us. Just before I introduce the guests, I will say, if you want to join the discussion, we will be taking questions. If you're watching on YouTube, post in the comments. I'll get to see the comments, and from there, I'll be able to ask any questions. If you're not on YouTube, please join in on Twitter. Just tag me at Andi Jarvis, and I will pick that up and hopefully ask the questions. I can't promise we'll ask them all, but we will do our best to see what we can do. And I would say one other thing: if you are interested in helping with any of the topics we talk about today, there are links in the comments for YouTube and above, if you're looking on the XMO Marketing website, to two organizations, the Black Lives Matter Global Network and the ACLU, and you can support them with donations if you like. Right, let's get to the important bit. Let's bring all the guests forward. So we're being joined by Krystal Taing. Krystal, give us a wave. Krystal's in San Diego. Leah Clark is in Belfast. Come on, give us a wave, Leah. No, she's not going to go. There we go. Rand Fishkin's joining us from Seattle, and Heather Physioc from Kansas City. We have one more guest. Oh, Heather will be back soon, I think. We have one more guest, Isha, joining us from Atlanta, and she will be along shortly. So let's get into it. First of all, Krystal, can you talk to us and tell us what's happening in San Diego and the sort of the states more widely at the moment, please?
Yeah. So first, Andi, I want to just commend you for bringing us all together. I think I have very similar feelings, and that anything that's happened in the last 3 weeks, professionally or personally, it feels weird not to address this. So just bravo for bringing us all together and holding this and being brave. So want to make sure you hear that first. But yeah, I'm in San Diego. I attended a Black Lives Matter protest about a week ago at this point. There's a little over 10,000 people that joined. And I think what it showed me is that there are so many people ready to have this conversation that look like me and don't look like me, that are in all types of organizations. So I just personally felt really inspired. While I think what you mentioned, Andi, in seeing that video of George Floyd, my personal feelings are like, why now? Like, this has happened many times before. But as soon as you kind of get over that feeling, I just am, I think, what do I need to do? What can I do to make an impact? So what I've seen with the protest in San Diego is overwhelmingly really, really positive. I think there is a lot of outblown kind of conversations around negative parts of the protests. And I've seen, incredibly powerful movements, speeches, communities, organizations, businesses really coming together to make a difference. And at the San Diego protest, they had the chapter leader of the original San Diego Black Panthers there. And he was really powerful in when he spoke and saying, like, what we're doing today is really reminiscent of what he was doing in the 50s. But the difference now is that the whole world is behind this conversation and behind this movement. And I thought that was, incredibly powerful. While we may not have moved as far as they had imagined, at least we've gotten, the attention of everyone we need to have to actually move the needle.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Heather, talk to us about what's happening in Kansas City, because I know you've been demonstrating, and I also understand you're doing some work on voter registrations and things. So talk to us about that. I also think Isha's just joined as well, so we might get her in to talk about what's happening in Atlanta after you, Heather.
Great. Yeah, in Kansas City, the protests began about not quite 2 weeks ago, I guess. And I just felt like I had to be there. So I went out, and of course, right away, we were getting tear gassed for peaceful protesting. But since then, things have calmed down dramatically. The police have been advised to take a more de-escalating stance. They're there to protect businesses in our local shopping district, but not to interfere with peaceful protesting. So that's an improvement. I wish they had started there, but it's an improvement. And I've been out to a number of different protest marches and community conversations as well, trying to get folks registered to vote. And I'm finding there's a lot of people with outdated addresses, or they've moved to the area, or they're 18 and voting for the first time. And the voting process is so complicated in the states, where every single state and even some counties have different regulations and laws, that there's a need to reduce this friction and get these very important voices to the polls. This is just one tiny thing that I'm able to help with. And I'm just trying to pivot to wherever the greatest need is.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Isha, are you there? Let's see. I think Isha might be coming in. If not, no, we'll go to Rand. Seattle, up on the northwest coast. What's happening up there? What have you seen up on in Seattle? Sorry, put my teeth in.
Yeah, so Seattle has been a little bit of a hotbed for a couple issues. Obviously, we had the first outbreak of coronavirus, and we did have continually substantial protests. My wife and I participated in one here in our local neighborhood, but in our old neighborhood, right outside the apartment where we used to live, there's a zone that protesters sort of, I don't know what to call it exactly, kind of won over from the police, right? There was days and days of peaceful protests. There were violent assaults and attacks by police and right-wing people, maybe semi-affiliated with police or not. And then the Seattle mayor told the East Precinct to pull back, and we have this district that's right outside our old apartment, like I said, literally outside the door, called either Chaz or CHOP. So Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or Capitol Hill Occupied Protests. But it's essentially it looks and feels a lot like a street fair. We have a bunch of friends who've been there. We have some friends' kids who are demonstrating there. But what it is essentially there's plenty of emergency services and businesses open, but no police presence. And so far that's gone remarkably smoothly and well, despite obviously the United States president kind of crapping on the mayor and the governor of Washington for not, I don't know, taking action, beating the crap out of protesters. It's we are a flashpoint right now, and it's pretty weird.
Is it that the protests in the States are being driven by a slightly younger audience? I know that's something we've seen here and something I'll get Leah to talk about shortly, but is this a young people's movement that's being pushed forward? And is that what you're seeing in the States?
I can speak from my experience that in our neighborhood, it was primarily folks in their 30s to 60s and their children who were out protesting, lots of young kids. But in Capitol Hill, it is much more, I think folks in their teens, 20s, 30s. That being said, all over the place. There are 60, 70 plus folks out protesting there, just like the guy that the police beat up in Buffalo.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say beat up, push over and injured in Buffalo. You see plenty of white hair and gray hair out there, but there is a tremendous amount of young people. I think probably a higher percentage.
Brilliant. Okay, so Leah, over in Belfast, you were on the Black Lives Matter parade and also had a moment of personal pride as well as part of that.
Yes, I did indeed. I attended 2 of the protests, one of them at City Hall, and then the other one was at Customer Square, where my dad actually gave a speech, which I was incredibly proud of. He doesn't give speeches, so it was a lot to stand up. I think there was maybe a couple of thousand at the protest at Customer Square. So there was a really great turnout for it, and there was a really, really great atmosphere there, really inspiring. And it really touched me that so many people in Northern Ireland came out and care about racial inequality and what's happening in America in the middle of a pandemic. So yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier, it seems to be, from what I can see in the local news anyway, that it's very much driven by a younger audience here in the UK, people in the 20s leading this forward. Is that what you've been seeing?
Yeah, at the protest I attended, I noticed, some might disagree with me, but I noticed that there was a lot of young people and also a lot of women at the protests. So I do think part of the reason why younger people may be taking the lead is partly due to social media and how we're able to engage in many of these issues and keep up to date with what's going on in the world and what's trending through hashtags and content shared on Twitter and Instagram. We've got so much more information readily available to us. So I think it's easier to use social media as transfer points between thoughts and actions and rallying people to actually show up on the streets and demand or call for change in the middle of a pandemic. So I also feel like the younger generation, we've grown up in a world where all we know is smartphones, and we've always had the internet, and I think that might have created a bit of a woke culture. Woke can be maybe described as being more aware of issues concerning racial and social justice. So I think maybe that's part of it.
Okay. Oh, cool. So 2 questions. One I want to ask to you, Heather, and secondly to you, Krystal. So Heather, the question for you is, are you surprised by how long these protests and demonstrations have gone on, that it wasn't just a flash fairly early and then it petered out? So that question for you. And then following on from that to you, Krystal, there's some fairly big moments coming up in the calendar for the States in the next few weeks with Juneteenth. If you could just explain that, because I'm not sure it's a huge awareness in the UK what Juneteenth is, and also then the 4th of July, and then there's a march in August. So do you think the protests are going to continue all the way through the summer? So Heather, to you first.
Yeah, I am, and I'm not surprised. I'm surprised it took this long for us to show up in this big way and in this sustained way. I'm surprised and disappointed that it's taken us this long to do this. At the same time, I'm very encouraged and moved that it is lasting this time. I think the pandemic does have something to do with that. I think people have more mental capacity and actual bandwidth in their days without commutes and without all these extra commitments of needing to be in the office and having our schedules full of things to do. We've got the capacity to show up at this. And I'm thankful that people are seizing this moment and capturing this momentum. But I think that has also created the capacity for us to, how do I say this? I guess care more and be more vocal about it. So you're going to see more and more people who look like me out there, unable to ignore the issues, woken up out of this complacency, and hopefully modeling that behavior for our family and friends to hold them accountable to those same standards. There's something different this time. And we need people to keep up the energy. I want people to rest. I want people to recover. And I want people back out there making real, tangible steps for change. And I think that conversation around making sure this is long-term this time has sort of shifted the mentality around the movement from being this temporary flash in the pan, I hope.
Okay. Krystal, what about the dates coming up in the calendar over the next month or 2 months?
Yeah, I would say this Friday obviously is Juneteenth. For anyone, you know, outside of the US that doesn't know what that is, it's the date that was 2 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, where slaves in Texas finally learned that they were no longer slaves. So it's, you know, a pretty big celebration. I know in San Diego every year they have a huge celebration. And what I'm seeing more and more now is a lot of organizations allowing employees to take it as a paid holiday. I think that is the trend that I'm seeing happen. I haven't heard much about July 4th this year yet. I feel like a lot of the things that have happened very quickly and very rapidly. So right now, really the focus is Juneteenth and organization around that day. Sorry,
I think Juneteenth is an amazing day, and I've been reading about this fairly recently, and the fact that it took so long. You know, we don't do a huge amount of American history at schools over here, but you know, you understand about the Emancipation Proclamation, and you just think, oh, that was it, and the next day everybody was free. That's not the case. I'm amazed to find that out. So that's a big holiday. But what I want to ask again to you, Krystal, I was talking to Isha yesterday, and if we can get her on, we'll let her talk about this, but I'll throw it at you. One of the things she was saying that, so you've got companies like Nike talking about, oh, we're going to let people take this off as a paid holiday. But does that only apply to sort of full-time salaried staff who work in the office? So if you work in the Nike store, doesn't apply to you. And the people who tend to work in the store tend to be the young Black people. So is it company-wide? Because there is an issue about organizations and how they've responded to this.
Yeah, typically not. PTO is usually applied to salaried employees, and then like, you know, hourly employees get their, you know, usually a more limited number. But I don't know. I haven't heard any details about the new holiday, because most organizations did not have this as a paid holiday before, you know, the last week or two. But I would imagine if someone's a responsible organization that they're applying it to everyone. Otherwise, they're missing the point to what you said.
Okay. Leah, I want to come back to you, and apologies if you feel this is an unfair question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. You referenced the fact that we're obviously in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, and social media is awash with people either on one side of the debate, which is either it's irresponsible for people to be going out marching and getting together in groups when there's a virus and a pandemic going on, and other people saying, do you know what? We've been fighting this virus called racism for so long. Stick here of the virus. It doesn't matter. We're just going to go. So what's your view on that?
I think this is a just cause, and I think there's power in protest, and I think it's so important that people exercise their right to protest. But I think we are in the middle of a pandemic and people's health is at risk. All I can say is the protest in Belfast was really, really well organized. Hats off to the organizers. They enforced social distancing. They had markers on the floor for 2 meters apart, handing out masks, hand sanitizer, and they also had ushers ushering people after it had finished to make sure there wasn't a big rush and people ensured social distancing. So I thought that was really great. So if future protests can be socially distanced and try and minimize risk, I think that's really important because we are still in the middle of a pandemic. And we can't forget about that.
Yeah. And we've just had a comment on YouTube from Adriana that says racism itself is a pandemic that's killing people. It tends to be people who aren't affected by that particular pandemic who are saying you shouldn't be out on the streets. Just a reminder that if you do want to join the debate, and please, that there are a lot of emotive subjects that we're going to be discussing today, please do contribute, put questions in YouTube. You can hit me on Twitter at Andi Jarvis, Andy with an I, as you can see on screen. You might not agree with everything we say. We might not agree between us with everything that's being said. So please do contribute. Please do ask questions. If you're not sure, if you want to DM me, please do. If you don't want to ask a question in public and you don't want your name mentioning, because I'd rather people ask questions today that says, I disagree with this. What's the point? And let's talk about it. That's what we're here to try and do. So I want to bring Rand back in and ask him a question about technology firms. So Rand, if you don't know, has been pretty vocal on Google particularly and the way they operate some of their businesses. But Rand, can you talk to us a couple of questions coming at you about Google and how they operate? So there's a book called Algorithms of Oppression, which I'll be honest, I haven't read, but I've kind of read the synopsis of it, the way that Google algorithms work and promote certain content. So the example it gives on the back of the book, that if you type in black girls into Google, you get quite highly sexualized and pornographic pictures. If you type in white girls, you get a different set of images. So talk to us a little bit about that and the challenges that Google have got. And also, let's talk a little bit about Facebook versus Twitter and how they're handling this, labeling Trumps when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Talk to us about all those issues.
Okay, as a tall order, I will do my best. First off, I think that one of the things that technology firms, myself included, right? I think that if I had been working at Google or Twitter 7 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have been equally guilty of crafting algorithms in this way, is that they represent and amplify the world around them, first off, right? So they do not do a wonderful or effective job of promoting our best selves. And also, I think this is very true on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, even on LinkedIn, certainly on Reddit, which has been a breeding ground for hatred and white supremacy years ago, and now it's largely shifted to other places, but still present. Is that these systems are crafted on algorithms that provoke outrage, and by doing that, right, by optimizing for engagement, you get a process that we have seen play out in larger society, where messages that 10 years ago, 20 years ago would have, sunk a presidential campaign are now popular and accepted by vocal minorities of the population, but still substantial groups. And that is heartbreaking, and it is really frustrating. And I think another big issue, for those of you not in the United States, you might have heard a lot about something that's in our Constitution, specifically called the freedom of speech, right? The First Amendment to the Constitution. And the idea behind the First Amendment is that Congress shall make no law that abridges the right of the people to of the free press or of the people to participate in religion. Unfortunately, it has been foolishly misunderstood by a huge group of Americans, including some in government, to mean that we must allow all kinds of speech, rather than that platforms themselves and individuals themselves can choose for themselves, private organizations can choose for themselves what content they want to allow and disallow. You do not have to publish every comment on your blog. You don't have to approve every comment that goes on the YouTube video. In fact, I'd really urge you not to. But unfortunately, these have been poorly understood, and I think freedom of speech is abused as terminology and as a law to represent something that it does not represent. And personally, I have been very passionate about holding Facebook and Reddit and Twitter and Google and YouTube and all these organizations accountable for the content that is on their site that has radicalized and incentivized conflict and hatred and intolerance in ways that I think are totally unacceptable. Andi, the last thing I'll say is, I don't know if you saw a few days ago, but I used SparkToro to look at my new company, to look at what police officers on social media follow, listen to, watch, visit, how they describe themselves. And it is disgusting. It is truly disgusting, right? It is a lot of white supremacist content. It is a lot of alt-right content. It is a lot of anti-Black content and people and sources. So yeah, maybe what we're seeing is representational of that.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. So we're going to come back to that discussion. But what I want to do, first of all, is Isha is here backstage. So we're going to bring Isha by the magic of technology. Isha, couple of questions to throw at you. Could you hear Rand, what he was saying just then?
Go ahead. I'm listening.
Go ahead. Right, okay. So could you hear Rand and the discussion we were just having then about tech platforms and that type of thing?
I caught part of what he was saying in terms of the responsibility of social media giants to not stifle freedom of speech, but to be mindful that some speech is insightful, instigating hate and some of the other issues that we're dealing with directly. I heard that part.
Okay. Well, first of all, will you tell us a little bit? You're in Atlanta, so tell us about what's happening in Atlanta. From a British perspective, Atlanta made the news fairly early on, but we haven't seen much about it since then. So tell us what's happening there, and then tell us your view on the likes of the Googles and Facebooks of this world, and have they let that freedom of speech element go too far? Because it can be hurtful ultimately. So
Atlanta's made the news quite a bit, as recent as Friday with another killing of an unarmed Black man and the burning down of Wendy's on the Southwest side. There is a lot of conversations on the leadership level. I would say organizations basically taking up the task to redirect and to refocus locals. Atlanta's built a little differently from most major cities. You do have a distinct sides of town, and so while one area is most of the protesting is happening downtown Atlanta, and around the Capitol building and the mayor's office. They're all on the same city block. All of the major attractions, tourism, most of the commerce that happens in Atlanta, that's where most of the protests are taking place. With regards to, there's kind of, I think, like a dichotomic or two-way.
Oh, keep going. We can still hear you.
Okay. There's a two-way. There's a two-prong approach to what's going on, allowing people to express themselves and protest, and to bring awareness to the situation. And then there's the where do we go from here, and who are going to be leading the charge, and what plans are we going to implement? With regards to the second part of the question on social media giants, realistically with any company, I feel like whatever their mission is, whatever their vision is, they need to stick with that. If that's not working, they need to adjust it and account for what their platform allows. So yeah, there's freedom of speech, and I agree that there needs to be a cap on what's allowed, like disinformation, like what do you call it? things that agitate. There's a lot of people that's intentionally agitating. People aren't even from America, kind of jumping in and adding their voices and creating strife intentionally. It's like any situation. Those are the kind of things you need to mitigate, because the purpose of them is not to inform, empower, or to move a conversation or to create a space for everybody to be engaged. So those networks and social media platforms need to be mindful of what they owe to society in terms of their contributions. So hold them to the same level of excellence that they hold the rest of us to. If you're going to hold us to it, you need to hold leadership to it, and they're the ones who are supposed to be the example.
So, Heather, I'm going to come back to you in terms of holding people to account. And Twitter received a lot of praise for flagging up Trumps when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And I'll express a personal opinion. There's no way I believe he didn't know what he was saying, and he didn't know he was quoting sort of 50s and 60s era racists. But you may or may not have done. But Twitter got a lot of credit for flagging that. Do you have a different view on that? Do you think that they were given too much credit?
A little bit, because it's like, why now? But I feel the same about Google not labeling questionable information about, Holocaust hoax or Holocaust deniers until much after it was identified as a problem. That said, I don't want to shame people for the past, because I think shame is the wrong emotion to confer onto people right now. I'm glad it's happening, but I kept questioning, why now? Why now label things that are risky, dangerous, wrong? And I think it makes sense when you take a step back and you realize that the leader of the free world, the current president of the United States, he's in this position of great authority and power and influence. So that confers a certain amount of risk when misinformation is being spread. And right now, our current president is not only spreading misinformation about Black Americans and what's happening at these protests and racial justice in general across this country, and LGBTQ and transgender rights, he is also spreading misinformation that is dangerous to public health. He's, wanting to host a rally in Tulsa where there's so many issues with that, but like where they're going to have everyone indoors, they're not going to be socially distancing, they're not going to be requiring masks. He's a dangerous spreader of misinformation. So I think that putting labels on this is a good move to make people at least question the content that they're seeing. But why now? Why just him? And how can this, where's the line, I guess? Who decides this? Where's the line? And how do we scale this if we decide this is the right way forward? It's complicated.
So I've just brought a question up on the screen, and I'm going to keep with you, Heather, on this. So the question is, what do you think of the calls by police unions in the UK to ban the protests in the current environment? But in the US, you've just made the point there that Trump wants to get a rally together for his presidential campaign, and that probably shouldn't be allowed. But do you hear voices then with people on the other side of the debate going, so you're saying that the Black Lives Matter parades can carry on, but these can't because it's for Republicans? What's your answer to that type of thinking?
Yeah, I have answers. I have thoughts. First of all, a rally inside is very different from a rally outside. So that's something that has to be considered purely from a scientific standpoint. Like the way the COVID virus spreads outdoors where there's moving air and the ability to spread out is very different from when it's contained indoors. So that aside, but then there's not a critical need for political hype rallies right now. There is a critical need to send the message to law enforcement and governments that police brutality and discrimination and violence against Black people in America is not acceptable. It never has been. It definitely isn't now, and it never will be again if we have anything to say about it. So if they think we're showing up big in a global pandemic, just wait until there isn't, because we're not done. Excellent.
So, Krystal, in terms of the sort of algorithmic approach and things like that to all Google, social media channels, whatever. We've got a mention here of first mention of the day of TikTok, which has had all sorts of abuse as well for the way it downplayed people of ethnic minorities. If you had a disability, you didn't get promoted by the algorithm, and they had to apologize for that. Is this just a wider issue? It's not just a US issue. And what's the answer? Who decides what's right?
Yeah, I think here I struggle with accountability. I think a lot of people are using their voices. There's a lot of there's a lot of visibility on these issues, but how do we hold the people responsible, accountable for making these changes? And I think that's where we talked a little bit more about like social and having a woke culture. The users of TikTok can hold, TikTok's algorithm accountable by using their voices, by using their comments, by bringing this to the forefront. Because if we think about TikTok, it's a very new platform. And the fact that they're already addressing some of these things, although they're not proactively addressing it that we've seen, I think it does show that they're willing to listen. They have to listen because their huge target market are the people that are out there protesting. So I think we all as marketers, as individuals, have to hold these brands accountable, even if we just think we're a single person with a single voice, not letting up. And I think that's really what's going to be the longevity about this. Like, we might not have protests for the next 3 to 6 months, but we can still use our voices, and social is a really powerful tool for that.
And I think, Leah, I want to come back to you because you touched on this right at the beginning about how powerful social is for your generation and how it spread ideas. And undoubtedly, there are issues with these platforms, but they are being used positively to amplify change. So where do you stand on this, this divide of it's a positive or it's a negative, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it is complicated. I think it's so important people are finally talking about these issues online. And I think it could also be argued that with young people, maybe 15, 20 years ago, people relied on print media, which may have had more certain biased views. Whereas nowadays people have so much more information and they're able to decide for themselves how they feel about it. And we all have our own platforms, no matter how big or how small, and we have the power to voice our opinions on these issues. And it's so important that we're having these stations. And I think recently I've found on my social media following that I've noticed a lot of young people of color who are actually speaking on these issues about racial inequality, their own personal experiences, and everything that's going on in the world. And I think that's fantastic. I think people need to hear about it.
And Isha, we had a little chat last night ahead of the stream, and I want to talk to you about how you engage with people on social media, because I think a really important part of social is how do we discuss and debate with other people who have differing views to us? Do you talk to them and try and change their views and opinions? Do you block them and keep them out of your social media circle and create a bubble? What's your approach when you see people on social media who have very opposing views to what you've got?
So my primary goal on social media really is perspective in one word, giving people the facts, the truth, so that when they see disinformation campaigns or misinformation or lies, outright lies from leadership, they can compare that with what's written or documented or analytically driven, and make their own informed decisions. There's a lot of people, talking heads and experts and that sort of thing. There's enough people with the same area of expertise or similar area of expertise as my own. So as a marketer, I guess I'm on the side of the good. I'm on the good side in the sense that I'm wanting to preach to or speak to integrity of information. So there's a difference between the agitator and the troll who's just trying to create conflict, to create division, to get that combative dialogue going so that they can continue to create more strife. And then there's people which are just strong and wanting to share their opinions, and they are open to discussion. So I think the most important thing to do on social media is to figure out what people's motives are. Do your best to filter and discern who is actually an agitator or a troll, not just the little troll type people, but the literal, whether it's Russian trolls or some of them come out of Africa and those kind of things. You have to kind of go down there and filter who it is you're talking to, and determine whether or not they're there to engage you with a dialogue or a meaningful dialogue versus somebody who's just there to agitate and create strife.
Mm-hmm. I know from a personal standpoint, I don't think I've ever managed to convince anybody to change their mind by having an argument with them on Twitter. I mean, it might not stop me trying, but I don't think I have. If you've managed to change somebody's mind, stick it in the YouTube comments, because I would love to see if anyone has managed that.
Life hack real quick. Bot Sentinel is something that I use to track who's communicating with me, whether they tag onto a thread or a comment that I've made, or whether I've commented on something or countered what they've said. I can go and see what their profile is, and if they are kind of a stated agitator, or kind of see what their the type of messages or comments that they make on a regular basis. And you can kind of tell from there and get a sense of whether or not they're there to have a discussion, or whether they're there to basically disrupt.
Yeah. And so, Heather, I just want to bring this question in and throw this one kind of at you from Arfan about, it's easy to get stuck in a bubble in social media. How do you, and I think you posted about this on one of your channels recently, how do you do that without affecting your mental health? Because I like to hear what the other side of the argument's saying. So I follow people whose views I find disgusting on social media. But when things like George Floyd's murder happens, I can't look at their content because it disgusts me. I can see it over in the UK today. There's a soccer player, a footballer called Marcus Rashford, who has been campaigning to get children in poverty free school meals across the summer holidays. So the government during the pandemic have been providing free school meals at home, but he's campaigning for this to be carried on across the summer. He came from a poor family, 4 or 5 children in his household, and was a beneficiary of free school meals. Feels strongly about it. The government have agreed today and said, yes, let's do it. This is a great idea. We have a notorious right-wing idiot called Katie Hopkins, who's now having a go at Marcus Rashford, saying it's disgusting that he should do this. He's a millionaire footballer, all the usual accusations. I look at that and I get so irritated by it. I don't want to see that in my feed. So how do you cope with that, with the negativity in your feed when you think, I'll just block it out, but then you end up in a bubble? What's the right way to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly imperfect in this respect, because I pride myself on protecting my mental health through all this so I can stay strong throughout the fight. I don't necessarily keep them in my feed. Instead, I try to seek out the opposing perspective when I think I've decided on my perspective, because I want to understand. So I guess that makes it a little more intentional than it just flooding my feed. It's much more about having that mindfulness and intentionality to seek different points of view. And I think this comes from big learnings we got after Trump was elected. I think a lot of, tree hugging liberals like me were like, what happened? Where did we go wrong? And I think a big part of that is we weren't listening to disenfranchise people and voters. We weren't having empathy for the other side. And so now I'm trying to be more intentional about at least understanding their objections, understanding what is preventing them from sort of coming to what I see as the right side. Because I feel like if I can understand what's making them tick and why they feel the way they do, then I can better counter those objections with meaningful conversation and persuasive points of view that might help them see things in a different way. I find, again, shame is not the right emotion for people to feel right now, because it forces them to be defensive and put up walls. But when we're listening with openness and empathy and kindness first, even when we vehemently disagree, we have a better chance of actually changing hearts and minds on those perspectives. But if we stop engaging, if we tune those people out, I think we're making a grave error in judgment. Mm-hmm. So mindfulness and intention was the answer to the question. Sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. So, Krystal, social media it's kind of a microcosm of society at large. And I want to talk to you about when social media becomes real life. How do you deal with, whether it's colleagues or family or whatever, of people who have difficult views? Let's euphemistically call them difficult views. How do you manage that?
So I loved how Isha mentioned and said she identifies whether they're agitators or trolls, because I think I approach social media a little bit similar. You can tell by the history of the things the person has liked and done and shared, whether they are open to listening, open to understanding. Because if they're just there to talk and share their own opinions and not listen, I don't think you're going to be successful in that. And so right now, I think the approach I've been taking in, my social media feeds is just ignoring it, maybe not necessarily blocking them or muting them, but I don't know that there's a point in having a public conversation with someone who's not willing to listen. But I have certainly, started on social media and taken it to a private conversation or a private chat, which I do think is oftentimes more powerful, because I think people do use social media to be seen, and in a private setting, I do think oftentimes they're more willing to listen, more willing to learn, more willing to understand your side of things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Leah, what's your view on friends and family? How do you engage with them? Because I know a few people have been in touch with you recently, asking, what should I be doing as a white person to help with this? What's your view there?
The things that I say is just, you can't be an educator for everyone, because Northern Ireland especially, all of my friends are white. So I'm telling everyone to educate yourself, find out about the history, sign up to the petitions, show up when it matters to protest, and have open conversations with opposing views, and keep that dialogue going. And I think it's really important, great that we're having these conversations, and it will change some people's minds. So but yeah, you're not going to change everyone's views. You're just not. But you can try.
So Isha, when we spoke yesterday, I dropped the bombshell on you that where I live, just outside Belfast, and where Leah lives, I think the black population's about 1%, and I remember your reaction yesterday was one of utter shock, given Atlanta is a majority black city, but. My view, we talked about having wide friendship groups of white people. And look, I'm mixed race as well. Half my family's white. So I have a view that we should have a real great role for white people in the discussion about race, because it's an education piece. And look, in Northern Ireland, where I am at the minute, if we don't have white people in the discussion, we're not going to have much of an army to combat this issue. What's your views on sort of the ethnic diversity, effectively, on people who should be involved in Black Lives Matter, and what should white people do there?
What's my repeat the last part of that question?
What's your view on the role that white people should play as allies in the Black Lives Matter movement?
I have a slightly different perspective. Two things. One, I'm not anyone's moral conscience. At this point, there are rules and laws that are in place to enforce parity, freedom for all. They're written all in our Constitution. So it's at this point a moral issue. It's a choice. And I feel like the people who should be leading the charge are just that, leaders. When there's an issue, a conflict, we look for leadership, whether it's from a political standpoint within the organization. Those are the people that we depend and rely on to make decisions, to SOPs, protocols, address conflicts, etc. So I am looking for leaders. If you have a title, manager, leader, CEO, executive office, regardless of your color, you are tasked to mitigate this conflict, period. So that would include our Asian and Hispanic and white counterparts, peers, family, etc. If you have the opportunity and you're in the position to lead change, then you are responsible for doing just that. I'm not trying to, I think, and it's really important because all of this happens on the community level. that flows up into the greater picture that we're seeing displayed worldwide. So it has to happen on the level where people can adapt to it or relate to it. So whoever is in your community that's a leader should be leading the charge. Do they have to come all the way from across town, especially in Atlanta, where it's predominantly white in the north and African American in the south? Do they have to come all the way down here to engage with us and they don't live in our communities? No. So I put the onus on leadership, and I put the onus on individuals to mitigate their own conscience.
And Krystal, I'm going to ask you what you think of that. But before I do, just to make reference, there's a number of comments coming in on YouTube, which are brilliant. And there's a lot asking for what practical steps can we take and how do we move this forward. The last section that we're coming to, kind of 5 or 10 minutes, it is going to address that. So please do keep coming with those questions. Krystal, what's your view on the role of white people, black people, and is it just a people issue? Where are we?
So I think in the last few weeks, we've seen a ton of organizations. They put out a black picture with white letters and they said something without actually really saying anything. And one of those turns into, employees and people of that organization, in this example, Adidas, holding their organization responsible. Like, you guys can't say something without doing something. And so it turned out where all of the Black employees at corporate said, we're not going to work until you implement some of these changes. And I read that, I thought that was powerful, but I know, like, I kind of joked, and I mean, it's sad to joke, but there's not a lot of organizations where there's enough Black people to do that and to stand up. And I think in that aspect, it absolutely involves, white people, Asians, of every ethnicity and race to get involved. And I think I've seen it certainly with some organizations, some, plenty of white people using their voices, their platforms to push for change. So to that, there's, especially in tech, especially in marketing and SEO, there's just not enough Black voice to push to make a change. So it does really require a lot of other people, white people, people of color to lead that change.
Okay, that's tipped us into sort of two different areas. So I want to, first of all, ask you, Rand, and secondly, ask you, Leah, so Rand, firstly, I want to ask you about Nike. They came out with the black tile, like lots of other people did, and lots of companies did this, right? And there was a couple of really vehement pieces written by marketing professors. So Scott Galloway and Mike Ritson, two guys who I like to read, saying, yeah, great, black tile's lovely, but show me your boardroom, right? And the boardroom's still entirely white. So yes, I see that side of the argument, but then Nike were also really one of the big backers of Cap, Colin Kaepernick, about his stance, and kept him on their roster even when the NFL was saying, no, we want you to drop him. So again, is this a black and white issue? Should they be doing more? Are they doing enough? What's your thoughts on this?
How could there possibly be an enough, Andy? That concept to me is completely foreign. There's never an enough, right? As long as iniquity is anywhere, it's a threat to justice everywhere. And I personally feel it every day when I get out of bed that there is no enough. That being said, I also want to, I don't know, there's two sides of me, right? There's the part of me that's so angry and infuriated and heartbroken and filled with love for Black Americans and Black folks everywhere I cannot find it in my heart to feel good about Nike or Microsoft or Google or anyone who, because there is no enough. And then also there's a part of me that wants to be logical and consider the fact that more is being done now than has been done in the past, and that incremental progress is how progress has almost always happened, not just in the United States, but in world history, right? It happens by degrees. And so let's positively reinforce positive momentum and movement. I have been very guilty of shaming people and corporations and calling people out. And yeah, I don't know that that's been helpful, right? That is the emotional part of me doing it. And also, right, I think we have a lot further to go. So boardrooms are a great place to make this happen. I think venture capitalists, investors, you know, a lot of the folks on Wall Street, a lot of the bankers can play a critical role here. There's an absolutely huge need to create vastly more generational and intergenerational wealth in Black families in America and beyond. And I think that there's a lot of Black economists who pointed out very wisely that until there is some more financial equity and equality, there won't be opportunities for racial equality. So what was the I'm trying to remember the woman's name, but I'm having morning brain. But she said, you know, make the hire, send the wire. I think that's a great message right now. Make the hire, send the wire. I know that's something I haven't written about it yet, but that's something that Geraldine and I are planning on doing.
Okay. There's a comment on the screen from Liz Brink. Show me your boardroom. Show me your cause marketing manifestos. Show me the vendors you're hiring. Show me the diversity metrics of your partnership and influencer programs. And then the second bit, and then show me a plan for how you're going to make it better. I think that's a statement we can all agree with. Leah, talk to us about a couple of the British examples of how some companies reacted to Blackout Tuesday.
So recently there was a tea brand, a British brand called Yorkshire Tea, and there was a tweet from a girl called Laura that said, "I'm dead chuffed that Yorkshire Tea hasn't supported Black Lives Matter," to which they responded, "Please don't drink our tea again. We're taking some time to educate ourselves and plan a proper plan of action before we about it, but we do stand against racism." And what I thought was really great was one of their competitors, another tea brand called PG Tips, tweeted back and said, "If you're boycotting, it does suck, Pamela, but if you're going to boycott teas that stand against racism, you're going to have to find 2 new tea brands now." So I thought that was a really great example of brands coming together on this issue on social media. Because brand activism is on the rise, and it's not just a PR stunt.
I think what I liked about that, and as a proud Yorkshireman, I always like to see Yorkshire brands do well. What I liked about that particular example was the fact that they hadn't posted a black square and a black tile. They hadn't been talking about it particularly, and they said quite clearly in that tweet, "We're taking time to educate ourselves." You know, the Black Lives Matter movement does feel a long way away from tea drinking in Yorkshire, even though it's sold around the country. But it's interesting that different brands take different approaches to it. Did anybody else see any brands take a really interesting and good stance? Isha, do you want to talk about Ben & Jerry's? And does anybody else have another example they want to talk about?
I'll talk about Ben & Jerry's and even Nike in context of the fact that they were leading the charge. They didn't have to wait for the George Floyd protests to be a catalyst for change. The brands that kind of showed up in between, from beauty to car manufacturers, even Porsche did a billboard here downtown Atlanta about "this is not what we expect." A lot of those things are like their diversity statements, things they probably have said internally, things that are on their website, but that they don't necessarily reflect in their actions. And I say that on the management, hiring level, equity, pay equity, all those things that roll into economics. So the fact that Nike and Ben & Jerry's was kind of doing the work before all this gives them way more credibility than the people who just kind of jumped in and they're following the trends and they're using the hashtag and they're just, "Hey, we're all, we're with you guys," and they're sending their solidarity statements. I say do that, but show me your work at the end of the day. You still have the responsibility to demonstrate, just like you do with your products, your goods, your service, and your customer service. Whatever you say, whatever your brand promises are, you need to be able to deliver to the public on that on the back end. So it's nice that they kind of put maybe a bookmark on the issue to let us know, the public know that they're in the game or they've got skin in the game, but we need for them to show some sign on the back end. So kudos. I don't like to give kudos to a particular brand because, again, that's me being their conscience. You need to do that anyway. I shouldn't have to come on this panel to have a discussion about how to love your neighbor, how to treat people with respect, how to do the right thing, how to pay people fairly. Those kind of things are common sense. It's just a matter of whether or not you choose to do it. So I'm looking for integrity in the brands. I'm looking for consistency, which is what they're supposed to be doing anyway. And I challenge marketers as well as those managers to hold their brands, their companies, their organizations accountable for what they said they're going to do. I got that neck roll, probably.
No, listen, that's brilliant. I love this. Heather and Krystal, you two can fight this one out. You two can talk about NASCAR, and talk about major American brands, right? One of you tell us what's happened, what the big news in that is.
Yeah. I'll say what happened, and then I'd love to hear Krystal's thoughts on this, because it's not what we would have expected, right? Like NASCAR, a predominantly white base, more rural, tends to lean more conservative audience, I'd say. They recently banned the American flag. I'm pretty sure they removed a driver from their roster that made either outright racist comments or was just anti-Black Lives Matter in general. I'm not sure. And then there's some last place participation trophy driver, I guess, that, threatened to boycott NASCAR, and they totally clapbacked on Twitter and were like, yeah, must be a devastating blow to lose all those participation trophy watchers. I mean, that is unexpected and out of left field. Krystal, what do you think about this?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the American flag. They banned the Confederate flag, which, if anyone, anyone outside of the U.S., essentially that was the flag of the South in the Civil War that obviously lost to the North. It's just, in my opinion, a weird thing to promote, to have the Confederate flag at all. But, NASCAR is based in the South, like Heather said, a very large white base. And if anyone, you just go search pictures of a NASCAR event, you see the Confederate flags everywhere. And they have their very first, African-American driver that, just put a little bit of pressure. And I think what this tells us is, no matter how insurmountable, change may seem like, as Rand said, this is a long process, and it's going to take a lot of really little steps to be in the world that we want to see in the next 10, 20 years. And something like that, while to me, it seems ridiculous that it even existed in the first place, should be celebrated. That NASCAR was just like, yep, let's do it. We're done. This driver's kicked out for making these statements. We're going to make this change. So I thought it was, powerful in itself. They should have done it. They should have done it a long time ago. But these small moments, I think, can be celebrated.
Absolutely. And I think there is a little bit, I think that there's a phrase that change only comes from the unreasonable man. I think it's something like that. It's quite an old phrase, but there's part of me that wants to be really, really unreasonable and just demand everything changes now. But then the history part of me knows that things tend to move incrementally. Leah, what do you feel or think about that, the speed of change? Should we be agitating and pushing for things to move really, really quickly? Or should we be happy with incremental changes and making things better? I am aware as well, I'm throwing all the really difficult questions your way. Sorry.
I think we have to be realistic. Obviously, it would be great for everything to change immediately and for people to realize, but sometimes I think that it might take a bit of time, especially with older generations. I think maybe some people are just that's their views and you're not going to change them. That's their bias. Whereas I think if we focus on the younger generation and education, there'll be a lot of hope for the future. And and change will happen. Maybe
I know. So one thing I want to get into, because I'm aware of the time, and Isha, come on, you come and tell us. Hold on, let's just 2 seconds, Isha. We just need to unmute you. Yeah, sorry, go.
Piggybacking off of Leah, unlike the civil rights movement, and even when Mike Brown was killed, I think that was 6 years ago now, this is catalytic, right? No one can say they don't remember where they were in 2020, right after a pandemic, and what happened in that period. The fact that change happened in 2 weeks that we've been waiting for since 1968, okay, means that things can move along a little faster. And I would not task anybody to lower their guard and say, we've got more time. We don't have more time. This is it for this generation. If we don't get in the waters now while it's stirring, you're going to let it, drop down just like any other trend. And then people go on about their business, especially once businesses open up full and people are going back to school and they get busy about their lives. This period is a crux, it's a crucible experience that everybody's going to remember. So they can't say whether it's Apple, where they were when people were looting their stores and why they were doing that. So I think that absolutely, because change did start happening, we already got police reform on platforms and discussing things that were not discussed for the past since Mike Brown was killed and all the other people that was killed in between that. I absolutely think that change can happen, not incrementally, but exponentially now. And I would hold every brand, every leader to that, because everybody was here when it happened.
Yeah. So
I'm sticking to it. Let me slide out.
No, that's okay. So behind the scenes here, we've got Aaron Abernethy from Inside Voice, who is making sure that this stream is working and that you can see it and that it keeps flicking around between people and I don't make any mistakes. Aaron's just posted one of my favorite phrases, which I didn't realize was Ernest Hemingway. But he was asked how he went broke, and his answer was gradually and then suddenly. But he's posted that in relation to what it feels like where we are now, that it feels like we are at a tipping point moment where we've gone through the gradual bit. As Isha said, we've been waiting since the 60s in America for civil rights to not just be written on a bit of paper, but to actually be happening, for people not to have their vote not counted or pushed out of the way, or for people not to be dying young because they're black, or not to be shot by the police because they're black. And it feels like we've just got to that suddenly point now. So hopefully we can keep the debate moving and keep it going. And what I think I'd like to do at this point is it gives us a great chance to sort of segue into talking about what actions can we take as marketers to help keep this discussion going. We have people at every different end of their career, from sort of early stage career, people who run companies, people who work in agencies, looking at what we can all do. So I want to ask each of the guests on the show of a practical step that you can take, or either just yourself or that you would recommend other people take, to help keep this discussion going, or what they can do to advocate in their organization. So it's a wide brief. And Heather, I'll start with you. Let's go.
Yeah, I have something that moved me to action. I have to be completely transparent. Like, I've always been, adamant about these issues, but I have not always been as mobile and active about these issues as I have been this time. And so I'm also having to do some self-reflection on why now for myself. So when I went to the first protest and people were getting tear gassed and, their eyes are red, there are people like hyperventilating, shaking, very scared. And there's nothing I felt like I could do. And my husband was with me and he said, use your skills. Use your skills. What are you good at? It's not first aid. So what are you good at? And then I'm seeing a lot of messaging from the Black Lives Matter movement about using your platform. So I guess my one sort of actionable tip for you as a marketer is ask yourself, what is your platform? Ask yourself, what are your skills, and what is something that you're passionate about that you can sustain long-term throughout the movement? So if you're working in the corporate world as a marketer, maybe that's recruiting and retention. Maybe it's training and filling the pipeline. Maybe it's creating tactical methods to gut check our work before it goes out into the world. Whatever it is, find your thing, because there are many, many good problems to solve here. There's no shortage of things that need to be done. just don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing anything at all.
Right. I love that. I think there was a phrase, it was Arthur Ashe, I think, the tennis player, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can, or something. I've probably misquoted him horrifically there, but it was something like that, which I really appreciated. Krystal, what's your view on this and what's happening at your organization?
So I think what I've seen and what I've pushed for is internal change. You know, if I am walking into a conference or a meeting or, you know, a webinar and it's full of, you know, very white faces and very male faces, I can do my due diligence to, you know, push for that type of change. I think everyone can do that. If you're being invited to speak, if you're evaluating a vendor, you know, especially if you got like an agency, a paid budget, ask the organization that you're considering, what are their, you know, diversity policies? What does their, you know, management look like? I think that's in our power to push and ask for those things and make that regular. Like, don't make that a question that people have never heard before. I think making that a regular, you know, thing that comes up in conversations is going to be helpful, and it's going to make people think that never thought about that before, that this is actually really important to us. It's important to our clients and, you know, prospective clients as well.
Yeah. Okay. Rand, you have led companies as well. So, because obviously I think the levers you can pull at different parts of an organization are obviously very different. So as somebody who has led businesses and currently leads businesses, what sort of things are you looking at?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I want to talk about something that I can't quite talk about yet because it's not public. But I do think that leaders at organizations have a responsibility to look at how they've built their companies in the past and how they have biased their hiring practices. We certainly did this at Moz when I was there, right? We looked for certain kinds of experiences. We recruited from certain places. We put up job posts in certain ways and in certain places that biased who we got into the organization. And yeah, I mean, it's weird. It's embarrassing to say, but you know, Moz was when I was there, we had reasonable gender balance, but pretty terrible racial diversity. The leadership team was the most diverse place, right? The rank and file was not, and that is on me for not pushing for that and not recognizing how much underrepresented and underestimated talent we could have gotten if we had been willing to do it. This is the thing. It is not. There's so many people, there's so many white people in power who think that this is charity, and it is not. It is not merely a moral obligation. It is also a business and organizational advantage. If you want to do the best work that you possibly can, you need diverse opinions and viewpoints, and you need to recognize that people who did not have all the advantages and opportunities that you had, maybe got to a more impressive place considering where they came from, right? And I wish we could recognize effort and talent in more diverse ways, right? Because talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. Right. And so you as a leader have to go out and recognize that. I'll say just two actionable things now. I think one, if you're in a position of leadership, especially in the marketing world, right? Many of you, I see Barry Adams on the chat. I see other folks whose names I recognize on the chat in YouTube. You get speaking invitations all the time, right? To webinars and conferences and events locally and around the world. And one of the things that I've been doing for a long time now is looking at the roster of the events that I get invited to and asking, hey, I see a lot of men on that roster. Can I recommend some women? Like, I don't want to speak on an all male panel. I don't want to speak on, I don't want to come to an event that is all or mostly men, right? And so I've been encouraging folks all over to do that. And that has mostly benefited, no offense, right? But that has mostly benefited white women, right? And like, step up, time to change, right? Time to be even more intentional about that, time to be, it might be uncomfortable to go talk to an event organizer in Romania and be like, hey, I see that everybody pretty much looks like me. That's, or Heather, right? And that's not great. The second thing I think you can do if you are a leader is to go look at where you're recruiting and how you're recruiting and change that. Change that to be cognizant of how your biases in your hiring practices, whether it's about college degree requirements or which universities you recruit from, or where you post your jobs, or how those jobs are phrased, or what your team pages look like on your website. I saw this great post on Twitter that was like, so are we going to get to the point where having your all white team photo changes from something you're proud of to a liability? Yeah, that'd be a step, right? That'd be a step.
So I want to come, Leah, to you, partly because look, you're at a different end of your career to some of the old folks on this chat. I know I have spoken up when I was in my 20s, quietly in organizations when somebody told a racist joke in my presence, and I complained about it to the chief executive, and action was taken. But I don't know, hand on heart, in my 20s, looking at my career in front of me, if I would have been making the noises I am now about race, because I'd be worried I'm going to get someone say, oh, he's a trouble causer. He makes everything about race. Should we really promote him? Should we really employ him? I'd be worried about those things. I'm in a position now, I run my own company. Like, if people don't want to work with me, fine. I don't care. That's all right. Move along. I'll find business somewhere else. But not everybody's in that position. So you're at an earlier stage in your career. Do you have any concerns about being labeled a trouble causer or anything like that? And also then the question I've asked everyone else, what practical steps can younger people take in organizations?
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from that. Being at the start of my career, in Northern Ireland especially, being one of the only people of colour in my whole organisation, I would be worried about speaking up on these issues, and I feel like maybe people in Northern Ireland might not understand. It's really important for young people at the start of their careers to put themselves out there and demand changes in their workplace and ensure that there's equal opportunities and demand work environments that reflect moral and social values, however uncomfortable that might be. I think it's really important to embrace change using our influence. It's not only the right thing to do, but I think companies in future will be better for it. I also think the younger generation at the start of their career will soon be responsible for making decisions that affect place cultures and people's lives. And there'll be a unique and fresh perspective of diversity and inclusion in workplaces. So now is an important time to start.
Great stuff. And Isha, what question? No, let me try that again. What one thing do you think people can do? What practical action are you going to take to help keep this debate going?
Definitely hold individuals accountable. I'm more in the space of managers and leaders. That's why I keep stressing that. I'm also a B school graduate, so I'm challenging all B school graduates who ought to know better to take a step up and lead in this space. Diversity, equity, inclusion is pretty much an inalienable right. We're kind of a little past civil rights. We're not talking about the things that we're all as human beings subject to, or basically that's something that we should all have, and we shouldn't have to have a discussion about treating people with respect. But here we are. As it relates to marketing, my thoughts are to Rubik's Cube your life. Most companies, all companies have a primary target audience, and in some cases, I think somebody mentioned, hey, if you're in a certain side of the world, you're not going to see the racial diversity, but there's other ways to be diverse beyond race and sex. So diversity of thought, especially if it comes to that. And so you have a primary target audience, you have a secondary target audience, and you have an alternative target audience. So at some point, you're speaking to a variety of people, whether or not that's the essential group for you as it relates to sales or soliciting your business. So just like a Rubik's Cube, I don't know if y'all can see that. I should have brought my Rubik's Cube out. Can y'all see this? Yeah. I need you to reconcile what you're doing from a marketing perspective and make sure that it aligns with your vision, your mission, and your values in terms of a company, but also that you're touching every demographic in those target audiences that you touch as a company, so that you are aligning your strategy with the group, but you're also making sure that all colors and people and thought processes are included in that strategy. So you don't send out a social media SEO, experiential marketing campaign without literally taking the Rubik's Cube of your organization and that strategy and reconciling it with all the people that's going to be impacted by that, even the ones who are indirectly impacted by that, so that you don't get on social media and have those ad fails and either Black Twitter or some other kind of Twitter comes in there and snatches your soul because you didn't Rubik's Cube it to make sure that their demographics wasn't touched because you're so stuck on, come on now. Everybody get there. Some of y'all might be, like never use the Rubik's Cube. I used to pull them apart because I couldn't get them all together. But if you got to pull it apart to get it all together, then you need to do that because our lives depend on this. And I think this is the moment in time where we will change history, Black history, American history, world history. And so I need the leaders to stand up. I need those in marketing to stand up and reconcile your strategy, your goals, and your efforts to make sure that everybody's included. Simple.
Isha, I am pinching Rubik's Cube your organization, right? And that is going to be in every presentation I do from here on in, right? I love that. I love that.
Make sure you give them their little, they're gonna need that little check.
Listen, right, we're quickly running out of time, but there's one question that came in on the chat that I wanted to ask before. I'm going to ask to you, Krystal, throwing you on the spot, and it's this one that is coming from Arfan about: have you ever had any difficulties discussing white privilege in the workplace, and how did you tackle this? Is that something you feel you can answer, Krystal?
Yeah, I certainly can. I actually got feedback from a random person on Twitter that was like, if anyone's having trouble, within their organization having this conversation, I will help you write an email. And it was just like someone I'd never talked to before, had, a few shared connections with. And all it took was that one single email to begin a conversation. And it's very similar to what we're seeing today. It's not like change happened that day or the next day, but it begun the conversation that is a path for change. And although it wasn't maybe received well from a lot of people, I think they started simmering on it and realized that this was actually a really important conversation to have. And it required their participation in this. So it's leaning on your network, leaning on your colleagues. I mean, I am someone that I don't talk a lot, I don't write a lot, but right now I'm kind of like, I don't care. I'm putting it all on the line. This is so important. If I lose it all, I don't care because this is just so important to me. So lean on whoever you can. There's definitely a lot of allies out there that are willing to kind of help with this conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you. So to wrap up, I'm going to ask you all, there's a long question there, but I think what Mick's saying is there's been lots of things and lots of lessons from the last couple of weeks and maybe more to come as well. But what are one of the main things that we can take away for marketers? What's the main lesson that marketers can take away? Rand, I'm going to throw this. I'm going to ask everybody to answer just as short as you can, because I know we're running out of time and people have meetings to go to. But go, Rand, I'll leave it with you.
Oh, man, it is very hard to identify one, but I think that I have never before felt such an obligation to be part of change. And I think that is a really powerful lesson for marketers, right? We know that marketing, that voices have the power to impact us and to change the way we view the world. And we have seen the power of marketing from an incredibly broad swath, a very diverse swath of society right now. And that has changed a lot of minds. Now we have to execute on it, right? We have to remove qualified immunity. We have to defund the police. We can talk about what that means, but we have to vote. We have to change the way we treat our Black colleagues. We need to change the way we hire and recruit, the way we build boards, the way we think about generational wealth, the way we think about property tax. Let's go do it.
Brilliant. Right. Isha, what's your view on this? Why have I got you mute? There you go. You're on.
Marketers are more or less of the moral police in a sense for organizations, because we're tasked with keeping brands accountable to, again, their mission, their vision, their values. So what you say, you just do what you're supposed to do, correct? So in terms of that, and also because our role is to make sure that there's a consistency in message. That's what brand is, right? Telling the story, but telling it over and over again until people get it. And once they get that story, they can act upon it. So our goal is to ensure that there is consistency in HR, in IT, in all the things within the organization, so that when you present yourself externally to the organization, that people are seeing not only the whole picture, but an authentic brand. So I task it to the, again, marketers. I'm holding everybody accountable. If you see me, I'm going to hold it to you to do the right thing because it's right.
Gotcha. Brilliant. Isha, if you have to dive off, please do dive off. That's fine. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful having you. Leah, what's your views on this? Leah, so what's your view on what one lesson can we take away from this?
I think for me, the lesson I'm taking away from all this is what can I do personally? And I've started thinking about brands and brands that I purchase from, and I think we need to be more aware about the brands that we're buying products and services from. So I think consumer activism is really important. And going forward in future, I'm going to do my research, and I'm only going to purchase products and services from brands that support this movement and who are actually they're backing up what they're saying publicly with real actions. So I think that's what I'm taking away from all this.
Excellent. And Krystal, what's your view?
I think overall is asking questions. Like, ask questions to people within your organization, to people outside of your organization, and just stay committed. Like, don't lose focus, don't lose steam. As we all said, like, there's a lot of change happening in a short period of time, but just hold those around you accountable. Like, if you are working with a business and they put up one of those statements, like, really ask them what they're doing to implement some of these changes, especially with their role in marketing and digital, and just stay the course and don't lose momentum.
Heather?
Yeah, I think as marketers and businesses, I think we've all seen it happen before, Rand probably especially, where people are like, stick to marketing, don't talk about race, don't talk about politics. I think our instinct for brands as businesses is not to participate in politics and take a stand on things a lot of the time. They're afraid to talk about race. In America, they're afraid to actually call Black people Black people. They're afraid to say the word Black. And I think it comes from a place of fearing saying the wrong thing. But this is so far beyond politics. This is a human rights issue. You need to engage in this conversation and in this movement. Employees, your clients, industries, the world is going to demand this. So we do need to be vocal and mindful and engaged in this. Like, burying your head in the sand and wishing it away isn't going to happen. It shouldn't happen. So when it comes to brands and marketers, have the conversations about what it means for your entire supply chain, the clients you work with, all the way to the people you hire and the people you put in leadership positions. We need to be having conversations about what representation looks like in the creative room as we're putting out marketing. We need to talk about what diversity, equity, and inclusion really means in marketing and in business. So we're out of excuses as marketers and businesses to avoid these conversations any longer. So have them.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, from my perspective, I worried about doing this. I did an interview last week for the podcast. I interviewed a guy called Michael Mitchell, who is the brand director at MailChimp, also based in Atlanta. It's episode 5, quick plug, that's out in about 3 weeks' time. And I said, look, I'm thinking of doing this thing, but I'm not sure, will anybody care? Does anybody worry about what I think? You know, should I really be doing it? And Michael said something wonderful along the lines of, every small thing is part of the bigger wave that's making a difference. So what I would say is, if you can, even if you think it's too small, even if you think it's just a small step, just do it. Just be part of the movement and keep this discussion going, because it really does make a difference. I can see from the comments that have come through today and the things I can see on Twitter that people are getting use out of this and being able to start discussions that they hadn't had before. I want to finish again with Michael. I want to thank everyone for tuning in, everyone for listening, everyone who's been asking questions and on Twitter. I would just reiterate again that there are links above if you're watching on the website, or below if you're on directly on YouTube. And on there, you can donate to a couple of organizations who will be able to help with some of the work that's going on in America. So Michael said this, and I thought it was just beautifully put the way he put it. So I'm just going to read it out word for word. He said, "The spark that lit this fire was extremely ugly, and you don't want to lose sight of how ugly it is. But there is something beautiful about the world taking to the streets in protest. It's a statement of everyone's individual freedoms across all of these very different countries, and there's something really beautiful about it." I think that's a great place to finish. Everyone, wherever you are, do what you can to keep this debate going. I would like to thank Rand, who's had to go, Isha, who's had to go, for being part of this, and for the 3 amazing people who are still here on screen with me, Krystal, Heather, and Leah, for being part of such a great discussion, for being so honest and open with us. I'd also like to thank Aaron, who's hiding behind the back, who wouldn't thank me if we brought him up on screen, just to say thank you for a lot of the technical elements that have gone on here. Please do reach out. Most of us are on Twitter, with the exception of Leah, because she's on Instagram and I'm just old, so that's how it works. But please do reach out. If you have questions, if you want to engage, if you want to chat, please do pick up. I'm sure everybody on the feed today will be more than happy to discuss with you. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your time. And please do, let's keep this discussion going. Thank you.